The Navajo are one of the most storied Native American tribes in the United States, with roots stretching deep into the deserts and high plateaus of the American Southwest. For centuries, their communities thrived across what we now call New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. They are a people of rich tradition, survival, and resilience, shaped by the harsh beauty of the desert and the spiritual power of their ceremonies. Yet their history is not only defined by tribal life, but also by their extraordinary service to America itself. During World War II, when the fate of nations hung in the balance, Navajo men stepped forward to fight alongside their fellow Americans. They became known as the legendary Navajo Code Talkers, whose complex and unusual language became one of the most effective secret weapons of the war. Japanese cryptologists experts in breaking codes were left baffled and powerless against the brilliance of Navajo communication. The code was never broken, and in many ways it helped tip the scales of war. The Navajo contribution was a triumph of both language and spirit. But just beyond this story of heroism lies another side of Navajo tradition, one that is far darker, more mysterious, and far harder to explain. But beyond the story of honor and victory, the Navajo also carry legends that stir fear rather than pride. Around desert campfires and inside family homes, they whisper of something that walks between two worlds, a being neither fully man nor fully beast. Among the Navajo, it is called the Yossi, but outsiders know it as the Skinwalker. The tale begins not with monsters, but with medicine men and women healers entrusted with sacred knowledge to cure the sick and guide their people. Yet, in these legends, some chose another path. They turned away from light-embraced murder and fed upon human flesh. In doing so, they cursed themselves to live forever trapped in a form that shifts between human and animal. The Skinwalker is not merely a predator of bodies, it is a predator of minds. It can mimic voices, slip into thoughts, and make you see what is not there. In the old stories, children were warned never to wander alone, for the Skinwalker could appear in daylight, watching from a distance with glowing eyes. This is not just ancient superstition. To this day, Navajo families speak of encounters with these creatures. And in recent decades, American soldiers claim they've met something terrifyingly similar. Among the Navajo people, no story is told with greater fear or greater caution than the story of the Skinwalker. Unlike myths meant to entertain or folklore shared for amusement, this is a legend that the Navajo themselves often hesitate to discuss openly. For them, the Skinwalker is not just a tale to scare children, it is a presence, a warning, a shadow that still lingers across the mesas and canyons of the American Southwest. At its heart, the Skinwalker begins as something tragically human. In Navajo tradition, healers known as medicine men and women were once revered for their wisdom. They knew the herbs of the desert, the rituals of balance, the songs that could heal wounds of the body and spirit. But just as fire can warm or burn, that sacred knowledge carried a dangerous temptation. According to legend, some of these healers betrayed their calling. They twisted their gifts into tools of destruction, abandoning their duty to help others, and instead embracing the path of violence, greed, and evil. In doing so, they crossed a line from which they could never return. The transformation is described in whispers. Once they commit the unthinkable murder, desecration, or even cannibalism, they become something no longer fully human. They gain power, but at a terrible cost. They become immortal predators, known as skinwalkers. Their bodies are said to shift between human and animal, their forms unstable, their eyes glowing in the darkness. By day, they may walk unnoticed among friends and family. By night, they run like the wind faster than any man, their footprints changing from bare feet to paw prints in the sand. What makes the Skinwalker more terrifying than any wild beast is not just its hunger for flesh, but its hunger for control. The legends say it can slip inside the human mind. It can make a victim hear voices that are not there, see images that do not exist, and even command them to act against their will. Imagine hearing your mother's voice calling to you from outside, only to discover that it was never her at all. Imagine hearing a comrade's laugh, a child's cry, or even your own name whispered in the dark, only to realize that the sound was luring you into the open. This is the power the Navajo speak of, and it is why the Skinwalker is feared as more than a monster, it is a deceiver. Parents warned their children constantly, never wander alone, never answer voices in the night, never trust what your eyes see when you feel that eerie presence nearby. Some even believed that Skinwalkers could sit among you in human form, hiding in plain sight, until the moment they chose to reveal themselves. The horror lies in the idea that anyone, an uncle, a neighbor, even a friend, could secretly be one. Navajo descriptions of the Skinwalker often emphasize its unnatural abilities. It is said to leap across mesas in a single bound, to run for miles without rest, to stalk its prey with the patience of both man and beast. Its eyes are described as luminous, glowing like embers in the dark, reflecting a light that seems to come from no earthly fire. The creature can appear as a wolf, a coyote, a bear, or even something half-formed with the body of an animal, but the twisted features of a human face. And if it is struck down, the stories say it does not die easily. Some claim it can only be destroyed if killed in its animal form, otherwise it will rise again and again, pursuing those who dared to strike it. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the belief that Skinwalkers are not rare. They are not singular demons, but rather cursed individuals who chose this dark path. Where there is one, there may be more. Where one family is haunted, others may soon suffer the same fate. This makes the legend not just a ghost story, but a warning deeply rooted in community. Survival trust is fragile, and danger may come from those you least expect. To outsiders, these tales might sound like superstition, but to the Navajo, the fear is real. Even today, many elders refuse to say the word aloud, afraid that speaking of the Skinwalker might draw its attention. Others share stories only in hushed tones, passing them down to warn the next generation. It is not uncommon for Navajo families to explain sudden misfortune, a sickness, a death, an unexplained disappearance, as the work of a Skinwalker. And so, the legend endures, as chilling now as it was 100 years ago. A tale of healers turned monsters, a story of immortality bought at the price of humanity. A creature not only feared for its fangs and claws, but for the way it can reach inside your mind and twist what you know to be real. This is the Skinwalker, half human, half animal, but entirely something else, something darker, older, and far more terrifying than either. The Navajo have always believed that Skinwalkers roam the wilderness, but the most frightening part of the legend is not that they are confined to ancient times. Stories of encounters surface again and again, passed from parent to child, often retold in whispers, long after the supposed event. One of the most unsettling tales comes from nearly a century ago, when a simple ranch hand rode out into the Arizona desert and stumbled upon something that should not exist. It was the late 1920s, or perhaps the early 1930s, when a Navajo man was employed as a ranch hand near Tuba City, Arizona, on the western edge of the Navajo reservation. He worked for a wealthy landowner, tending to livestock, mending fences, and riding the open range. One day, longing to see his family who lived across the border in New Mexico, he asked his employer for a few days of leave. With permission granted, he saddled his horse and began the long journey home. The desert stretched endlessly before him, canyons carved by ancient rivers' mesas, rising like stone fortresses, the kind of stark beauty that only the Southwest can hold. For hours he rode the sun beating down by day, the cool silence settling in by dusk. At one point he stopped to rest, gazing across the horizon where shadows stretched long across the sand. It was then that he noticed movement on a ridge not far away. Sitting there, poised like a sentinel, was an old, mangy coyote. Its fur was patchy, its frame gaunt, yet its eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill through his spine. Coyotes were common in the desert, but there was something wrong about this one. Perhaps it was the way it sat so still, as though waiting for him. The ranch hand, uneasy, pulled out his rifle. He aimed carefully, squeezed the trigger, and watched as the coyote dropped to the ground. Relieved, he decided to inspect his kill. He climbed the ridge, slowly, rifle still in hand. But when he reached the top, his relief turned to horror. Lying before him was not the body of a coyote. Instead, sprawled in the dirt, was the form of a young Navajo man. His long black hair was streaked with paint and strange designs, his bare chest decorated with markings the ranch hand did not recognize. Yet his lower half was covered in fur, the unmistakable legs and tail of a coyote, half man, half beast. The ranch hand froze, the reality of what he had done crashing down on him. He had not killed an animal. He had killed something that should never have existed at all. Panic seized him. He looked around terrified that others might have seen, afraid that the creature's family or its kind would come searching for revenge. In desperation, he dragged the body to a nearby crevice along the canyon's edge. The effort was brutal, the body heavy and unyielding, but fear gave him strength. With one last push, he hurled it over the cliff and watched it vanish into the shadows below. His heart pounded. His breath came fast. He knew without doubt that he had stumbled into the very heart of the Skinwalker legend. Without wasting another second, he mounted his horse and fled. Through the night he rode, urging the animal past, exhaustion racing across the desert as though the devil itself were at his heels. The stars wheeled above him, the cold wind cutting his face, but still he pressed on, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and that cursed ridge. Finally, after crossing the Chusca Mountains near Shiprock, New Mexico, he arrived at his relative's home. Exhausted and shaken, he recounted what had happened to the coyote, the transformation, the half-human body he had thrown into the canyon. His relatives listened in growing dread. When he finished, they did not hesitate. Their voices were urgent, almost commanding. "You must never go back. You can't return to your employer. The family of the Skinwalker will be looking for answers, and they will be looking for you." The warning chilled him more than the encounter itself. If the Skinwalker's kin knew what had happened, then they would not stop until they found him. To return would be to invite death, or worse. From that moment on, he stayed with his family, never again setting foot on the ranch where he had once worked. For outsiders, it might be easy to dismiss the tale as superstition, or perhaps the result of fear and imagination. But among the Navajo, the story spread quickly, and its lesson was clear. Skinwalkers were not just shadows of the past. They could be encountered even in modern times, even by ordinary people. The ranch hand's experience became a chilling reminder of why the Navajo avoid speaking of skinwalkers casually. It was not a tale told for entertainment, but a warning etched into memory. To kill a skinwalker even by accident is to invite its curse. To reveal its existence is to invite danger. And to cross its path is to risk far more than death. It is to risk becoming entangled in the darkness that gave birth to the Skinwalker in the first place. Even now, nearly a century later, the desert around Tuba City carries that echo. Travelers still speak of strange shapes on the ridges of glowing eyes, watching from the hills of coyotes that do not move like coyotes should. And though the ranch hand's name may have been forgotten, the fear he carried has not. It lingers in every whispered story, in every warning passed down through Navajo families. The Skinwalker is real, and it may be closer than you think. The legends of the Navajo of healers who turned into monsters of shadows that stalk the desert have always carried an ominous weight. For generations, families told their children not to wander alone, not to answer voices in the night, not to trust the eyes of a coyote glowing in the dark. In Chapter 2, we look at how those fears became real for a ranch hand in the 1920s when he stumbled upon a creature, half man, half beast. His terror, his desperate flight, and his family's warning not to return showed us how seriously the Navajo treated these encounters. But what happens when these ancient stories collide with the modern world? When men in uniform armed with radios and rifles find themselves face to face with something out of legend? To answer that, we move forward nearly 60 years into the 1980s, when American soldiers on a midnight patrol discovered that the fences around their base were no defense against the Skinwalker. The base was called Camp Navajo. Its name alone was enough to stir curiosity, lying just west of Flagstaff, Arizona, on land once occupied by Navajo people themselves. In the early 1980s, it served primarily as a munitions storage facility. Long rows of bunkers dotted the isolated landscape, and soldiers were tasked with guarding the perimeter against intruders. Barbed wire and warning signs marked the fence line, but beyond it stretched miles of desert and pine forest land that had held Navajo ceremonies, settlements, and perhaps darker things long before the first barracks were built. It was on one such night patrol that two young soldiers, ordinary men just doing their job, walked their route along the fence. The air was still the moon, high, the desert unusually quiet. Their eyes scanned the shadows outside the wire, looking for poachers, trespassers, or anyone foolish enough to try stealing from a military installation. Then behind them came a sound. Both men froze. The noise was not from outside the fence, but from within, from their side where no one unauthorized should have been. They spun around, rifles raised. What they saw made their blood run cold. Standing no more than 30 feet away was an old man. He wore buckskin clothing, his hair long and gray braided down his shoulders. In the moonlight, his hair seemed to glow as if silver threads ran through it. He looked ancient, out of place, and most alarming of all, completely unfazed by the weapons pointed at him. The soldiers shouted, commanding him to raise his hands. The man didn't move. He stood there silently staring. They shouted again, louder this time, but still he did nothing. At this point, the men considered shooting. After all, the old man was in a restricted zone, ignoring direct orders. But neither soldier could bring themselves to fire. He looked frail, harmless, even confused. Perhaps they thought he was sick, or suffering from dementia, a wanderer who had somehow slipped inside the fence. One of them reached for the radio, trying to call it in, but only static filled the channel. No matter how they tuned it, the device was useless. The distraction lasted only a heartbeat, but when they looked up again, the old man was gone. In his place sat a massive rabbit. The animal crouched where the man had stood, its ears tall, its eyes reflecting the moonlight. It watched them. Neither soldier moved. Their minds scrambled to make sense of what they were seeing. A man does not vanish into thin air. An old man does not transform into a rabbit. And yet the evidence was before them. As they struggled to process it, the rabbit bolted, darting toward the fence. Their eyes followed it, hearts pounding. And then came another noise again from behind them. When they spun around, rifles raised a second time. Their fear deepened. The old man was back, but this time he was no longer inside the fence. He now stood on the outside beyond the barbed wire, staring in at them from the desert beyond. The soldiers froze. The fence was at least 8 to 10 feet high, topped with barbed wire. There was no gate nearby. There was no possible way the old man could have crossed it, not in the few seconds their eyes had been diverted. And yet there he was, calm, watchful, as though mocking their disbelief. That was enough. Without another word, both soldiers ran. They sprinted down the fence line, abandoning protocol, abandoning the idea of calling their commander. Later, when they finally dared speak of it, they agreed to keep silent. Who would believe them? Two young soldiers claiming that an old man had turned into a rabbit and back again, leaping across military fences without effort. Years later, one of them told the story while drunk at Thanksgiving, still shaken by the memory. His family remembered the way his face paled, the way his hands trembled as he recounted it. More than 30 years had passed, yet the fear was as raw as if it had happened yesterday. He had seen, he insisted, a skinwalker. The Camp Navajo incident remains one of the most unsettling soldier encounters tied to the legend. It links directly to the Navajo warnings that skinwalkers can appear in human form during the day, that they can shift into animals at will, that they can bypass man-made barriers as though they mean nothing. And it also ties back to the ranch hand's story from Chapter 2. Just as that man faced a creature shifting between human and coyote, these soldiers faced something that blurred the line between man and rabbit. The pattern is unmistakable. Different eras, different witnesses, yet the same chilling motif: creatures that walk between forms, creatures that watch from the darkness, creatures that refuse to obey the natural laws we depend on. For the soldiers of Camp Navajo, it was not folklore or family warnings, it was a lived experience. And it was only the first of many such encounters reported across American military bases, where the wilderness presses against the edges of human order and where even under the watchful eye of floodlights and barbed wire, the legends of the Navajo still find a way inside. The Navajo warn that skinwalkers can appear as animals, but never in a way that feels natural. Their movements are wrong, their presence unsettling their actions, a mockery of the living creatures they imitate. In the ranch hand's story from the 1920s, we saw this in the form of a half-man, half-coyote abomination. In Camp Navajo during the 1980s, soldiers witnessed an old man vanish into the form of a rabbit, only to reappear outside a military fence. These encounters teach us something important when the skinwalker reveals itself. It often chooses a shape we recognize, but twisted bent just enough to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. That pattern continued decades later on a Marine Corps base far from Navajo land. This time the setting was Camp Pendleton, California, a sprawling installation north of San Diego. To most outsiders, Camp Pendleton is a place of dust scrub brush and training exercises. But to the Marines who have spent nights roaming its deserts, the land holds secrets as old as the tribes who once lived there. One Marine recounted his story to the Project Tales from the Grid Square. He was a man not easily shaken. He had endured the grueling life of a rifle squad, the long marches, the sleepless nights. Yet what he and his comrades saw on one of those nights remained with him forever, unsettling him in a way no battlefield ever had. It happened during Exercise Steel Night, a division-level training operation that brought entire units out into the wilderness. For days, they dug in setting up defensive positions in the rolling hills above a mock combat town known as Camp Horno. The night was clear, the desert air sharp, and the Marines rotated shifts on the guns, their eyes scanning the dark valleys below. The witness recalled how one of his buddies began telling a story during their watch. The Marine claimed that as a child, he had once seen a skinwalker. His voice was low, but the words carried weight. He insisted the creature had followed him for years, lurking at the edges of his life as though bound to him. The men around the gun pit grew restless. They laughed nervously, but none could shake the unease in his tone. Only one Boot, a fresh Marine, straight out of boot camp, was with them that night. To ease his burden, the others offered to take a longer watch so he could get some rest, but rest never came. Barely 30 minutes into their shift, the Boot sat up suddenly. He swore he was hearing something strange, a sound he compared to the clicking noise made by the Predator in the old movies. Except this sound was faster, sharper, and carried through the brush with unnatural clarity. At first, the others dismissed it as imagination. Sleep deprivation can play tricks on the mind, but soon they heard it too. A clicking followed by a screech and the rustling of dry brush on the hillside. The Marine who had told his childhood story grew pale. He whispered that it was the exact same sound the skinwalker had made years before. That was enough to silence the group. They adjusted their optics, straining to see through the darkness. One Marine held a 13 Golf thermal scope and swept it across the valley. What he saw froze his blood. In the green glow of the thermal, a shape emerged. At first glance, it looked like a deer. Its body was slender, its head crowned with antlers, but then came the impossible detail. It was standing upright, balanced on two legs like a man. The Marine blinked, certain his eyes deceived him. But no, the shape was clear. It moved with a strange, jerking gait, then suddenly bolted, sprinting up the hillside directly toward their position. As it ran, its body shifted unnaturally, dropping onto all fours, then back onto two legs again. By the time it reached their flank, it darted past and vanished down the opposite side of the hill. Another Marine with a different thermal scope confirmed it. He had seen the exact same thing. Whatever it wasn't a trick of one man's imagination. Two separate devices, two separate Marines had witnessed the same creature in the same moment. In the silence that followed, no one spoke of shooting. No one thought of pursuit. They simply sat in shock, gripping their weapons tighter than ever before. And when dawn broke, they gave their squad a new name, Skinwalker Guns. What began as a half-joke, half-admission of terror became a mark they carried proudly, as though to say, "We saw it. We know it's real." Skeptics might argue that deer sometimes rise on their hind legs to fight or reach for leaves that night. Vision goggles distort shapes that fatigue, makes the mind conjure phantoms. But what those Marines described went far beyond any natural explanation. Deer do not stand like men, they do not screech or click like machines. They do not sprint toward gun emplacements in the dead of night and vanish like shadows. The Camp Pendleton encounter connects seamlessly to what we've already seen. Like the Coyote Man of the Ranch Hands story, like the old man rabbit of Camp Navajo, this creature blurred the line between human and animal. It revealed itself at night in the wilderness when men believed themselves safe inside the power of their technology. And as always, it left behind no evidence but fear. For those Marines, it was more than a story. It became a part of their identity. And in that, we see the true power of Skinwalker legends to take hold of the human mind, to etch themselves into memory, to transform even hardened soldiers into believers. From the lonely ranch hand of the 1920s who shot a coyote only to find half a man lying at his feet, to the soldiers at Camp Navajo who saw an old man vanish into the form of a rabbit, to the Marines at Camp Pendleton who watched a deer rise on two legs and sprint like a man. The pattern has become impossible to ignore. Again and again, those who stand watch in the wilderness encounter things that should not exist. The further we look, the more we see the same warning written across time. Skinwalkers are not bound by legend alone. That warning came again in the summer of 2021 during one of the most destructive wildfires in California history. The blaze was called the Dixie Fire, a monster inferno that consumed nearly 1 million acres, destroyed entire communities, and left the air choked with ash. Amid the chaos, the California National Guard was deployed to assist with security. Their mission was straightforward: block off roads, keep civilians from wandering into danger, and ensure that only authorized personnel entered the evacuation zones. For soldiers, it might have seemed like a routine assignment. No enemies to fight, no combat, to prepare for just long hours, posted at rural checkpoints, generator lights buzzing, radios crackling. But as we've already seen, the wilderness does not need a war to become dangerous. It only needs the right moment to reveal what hides within. One night, a lieutenant, his driver, and a private first class were making their rounds, checking on their men stationed at various roadblocks. They stopped at one checkpoint where half a dozen soldiers stood around talking, trying to pass the time. The forest loomed beyond the beams of the floodlight, dark and unsettled its silence, broken only by the distant crack of burning timber. Then came the scream. It cut through the night like a knife, high, piercing, unmistakably human. Every soldier froze. Instinct kicked in. Weapons were shouldered flashlights swung toward the tree line. The sound came again, a woman's voice raw with terror echoing from the woods. The men had been warned before deployment that screams in the forest often mean mountain lions attacking deer. But this was too close, too clear, too deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal at all. It sounded exactly like a woman in desperate need of help. The lieutenant stepped forward and shouted into the darkness, "Hello!" And that was when the night shifted from alarming to horrifying. From the woods, in the exact same cadence, in the exact same tone, the voice came back. "Hello." It was not an echo. Every man there swore the word was spoken back at them, not reflected. It was the lieutenant's own voice, his own pitch, his own rhythm mirrored back from the trees. Panic surged. The men fell back toward their vehicles. The lieutenant barked an order. Lock the doors, stay inside, do not respond to anything else they might hear. Within seconds, engines roared to life, and the soldiers pulled out of the checkpoint, leaving the darkness behind them. Later, when recounting the event, one soldier admitted he'd rather face the wildfire itself than whatever was in those woods that night. Fire was predictable. You could see it, smell it, fight it. But the thing that called back in his commander's voice, that was something no training had prepared them for. The Navajo warn that skinwalkers are deceivers. They mimic voices, sounds, even familiar faces, all to lure victims into the open. Just as the ranch hand's family told him never to return, and just as Marines gave their squad the name Skinwalker Guns after what they saw. These guardsmen left their checkpoint with a new understanding. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you cannot see, the one that knows your voice better than you do. And if skinwalkers could once stalk Navajo families in the deserts of Arizona, and if they could appear on military bases surrounded by barbed wire and armed patrols, why should we be surprised that they would also emerge in the chaos of a wildfire when the land itself was burning, when panic filled the air, and when soldiers were vulnerable, tired, and alone in the dark? From the desert canyons of Arizona to the wildfire forests of California, skinwalker encounters always seem to follow the same unnerving pattern: creatures that blur the line between human and animal voices, that mimic presences that defy logic. Each story we've explored so far, the ranch hand who killed a half-man, half-coyote, the soldiers at Camp Navajo who watched an old man transform into a rabbit, the Marines at Pendleton who saw a deer sprint on 2 legs, and the National Guard who heard their lieutenant's own voice echoed back from the woods, has carried us deeper into the same unsettling truth. But if those stories left us unsettled, this next one pushes us to the very edge of fear. It took place not in a desert or a wildfire zone, but on one of the most important military installations in America, Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia. A place of training, discipline, and order. A place where thousands of Marines pass through every year. And yet, even here, far from Navajo lands, a patrolman encountered something that shook him to his core. The man telling this story was a military police officer. By the time of the encounter, he had spent years outdoors, hunting, camping, and running through forests since childhood. He was no stranger to the night, no stranger to wildlife, and no stranger to solitude. Unlike many, he wasn't easily frightened by shadows or the cry of an animal in the dark, which is why his testimony carries such weight. If a seasoned outdoorsman says something unnatural happened, it is because he truly believed it did. It was November. The nights at Quantico had grown long and bitter, the kind where the cold bites at your skin even under layers of gear. The officer had just finished posting Marines at their gates when he drove out to the western side of the base. West Quantico was sprawling, full of old cemeteries, forgotten training grounds from World War II, and roads that wound deep into the forest. Out here, communication was poor. Radios crackled with static, leaving patrols isolated in the dark. Parking his vehicle, the officer decided to check a tree stand where he had set a trail camera. He walked a mile into the woods, flashlight in hand, until he reached the spot. He climbed into the stand, swapped the camera chip, and began scanning through photos. Mostly turkeys, nothing unusual. Then he heard footsteps. At first, he thought it was another Marine lost during land navigation training. He shut off his light and waited, curious to see who it was. The footsteps drew closer, slow and steady, until he could make out a shape in the moonlight, a deer. But this deer was wrong. Instead of grazing or passing by, it lowered its head and began slamming its skull into a tree. Once, twice, again and again, until the sound of cracking bone filled the night. The officer froze, horrified, as blood sprayed and fragments of bone littered the ground. Still, the deer smashed its head until its skull was broken open. And then, impossibly, it stood upright on its hind legs. The broken ruin of its head turned toward him. Though its eyes were destroyed, he felt its gaze pierce straight through him. And in a clear human voice it spoke, "I know you're there." Terror locked him in place. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even reach for his sidearm. He sat frozen, certain that death had found him. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature dropped back onto all fours and walked calmly away into the darkness. Only when the sound of its steps had faded did the officer scramble from his stand. He left his equipment behind, sprinted back to his patrol car, and didn't stop running until he was safe in the glow of the base lights. For the rest of the night, he refused to return to the woods. Later, when he dared to go back with a fellow Marine, the tree was splintered and stained with blood. Bone fragments still lay scattered on the ground. This story, more than any other, captures the essence of the Skinwalker fear. It is not just the sight of something unnatural, not just the mimicry of a voice, it is the direct intrusion into the human mind. A monster that looks you in the eye and tells you in your own language that it knows you're there. From Navajo canyons to Quantico's woods, the pattern remains. Wherever soldiers stand guard in the wilderness, the skinwalker seems to find them. And the deeper we go, the more it feels less like coincidence and more like a haunting truth that refuses to be ignored. The stories we have followed from the ranch hand in the 1920s to soldiers at Camp Navajo Marines at Pendleton Guardsmen during the Dixie Fire and the MP at Quantico paint a picture too consistent to ignore. Different men from different generations, stationed in different landscapes, all encountered something that blurred the line between human and beast reality and nightmare. It would be easy to dismiss them as campfire tales or the product of fatigue. But when dozens, even hundreds of service members report such experiences, the question is no longer whether they happened, but what they truly mean. That is why a U.S. Army soldier named Nick Orton began collecting these accounts. His project Tales from the Grid Square has gathered nearly 500 bizarre reports from soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and even foreign militaries. What's striking is not just the variety of stories, strange lights, spectral figures, beasts that defy description, but how eerily similar many of them are. Marines at Camp Pendleton and an MP at Quantico, for example, described deer that moved like humans. Soldiers in Arizona and California reported voices mimicking their own. These men and women never met each other, yet their testimonies echo the same motifs: mimicry, transformation, deception. The sheer volume of accounts gives weight to the possibility that what we call folklore may instead be fragments of something real. After all, soldiers are trained observers. They are taught to notice details under stress, to identify threats quickly, and to record what they see with accuracy. When such people, men and women hardened by discipline and often skeptical of superstition, tell us they saw something unnatural, it compels us to listen. But soldiers are not the only voices preserving these warnings. For the Navajo themselves, skinwalker stories are not merely legends, they are lived truths treated with respect and caution. No one embodies this connection between the ancient and the modern more clearly than Wally Brown. Wally is a Navajo medicine man whose family can trace their lineage back over 5 centuries. From childhood elders recognized him as someone destined to carry forward sacred knowledge. He trained in ceremonies, prayers, and traditional healing practices. But Wally is not just a keeper of old ways, he is also a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, having served during the 1960s. With him, the two worlds we've been exploring converge: the Navajo tradition and the American military. On his YouTube channel, Navajo Traditional Teachings, Wally often shares the wisdom of his people. Though he hesitates to speak on dark subjects, he has addressed the skinwalker, directly describing it as tied to the evil one, a force of corruption that twists life itself. When we place his words beside the soldiers' testimonies, a chilling pattern emerges. Navajo legends warn of beings that shift between man and animal, that mimic voices that thrive on fear. Soldiers across decades and bases describe precisely the same things. It is here, standing between Navajo wisdom and modern testimony, that we find the reality anchor of this story. The skinwalker is not confined to the past nor to imagination. It moves at the edges of the known world, seen by men with rifles as well as men with prayers. And if the patterns align, then perhaps what soldiers are encountering in forests and deserts is the same terror the Navajo have warned of for centuries. When we step back and trace the path of these stories, a pattern becomes clear. It begins with the Navajo who have carried these warnings for centuries, about healers who chose darkness, about creatures that wear the skins of animals, about voices that are not what they seem. We saw how those warnings took form in the tale of the ranch hand in the 1920s, when a coyote's body became a half-human corpse at his feet. We saw them again at Camp Navajo, where 2 young soldiers watched an old man transform into a rabbit and cross a fence no human could climb. At Camp Pendleton, Marines caught a deer walking upright, its body shifting in ways no animal should. During the Dixie Fire, guardsmen heard a woman scream that became their own commander's voice. And finally, at Quantico, a military police officer saw a deer batter its skull until it shattered, before standing on two legs and telling him in perfect clarity, "I know you're there." Each of these accounts could be dismissed on its own. A trick of the eye, fatigue, a story embellished with time. But taken together, they create a haunting mosaic, one that stretches from the deserts of the Southwest to the forests of Virginia. Soldiers of different branches, different generations, and different backgrounds, all describing encounters that echo the same themes Navajo elders have whispered for centuries. The question then becomes impossible to avoid. Are these merely coincidences, or are we staring into the face of something older, darker, and very real? Skeptics argue for logic. They point to stress exhaustion, the tricks of night vision goggles, or the mind's tendency to conjure shapes in the dark. And perhaps some of these accounts can be explained that way. But does that explain the mimicry? The voices calling back in perfect imitation, the identical motifs of animals moving like men repeated across decades and thousands of miles. The Navajo say that skinwalkers thrive in secrecy, that they move best when ignored, when denied, when dismissed as fantasy. And if that is true, then perhaps the very act of disbelief is what gives them room to remain. For the rest of us, the conclusion is less certain. Maybe these soldiers stumbled into the shadows of old myths. Maybe they faced the echo of something supernatural, a force tied to land and blood. Or maybe, just maybe, they uncovered what the Navajo have known all along, that some boundaries between man and beast, between the natural and the unnatural, are not meant to be crossed. What we do know is, this generation after generation, people still see them. From campfires to combat bases, from folktales to military testimonies, the skinwalker continues to appear, refusing to vanish into history. And so the final question remains hanging in the air, like the echo of that voice in the woods. If the soldiers of today are meeting the same beings the Navajo warned of centuries ago, then what does that mean for the rest of us walking in the dark, listening to voices we think we know? From the deserts of the Navajo Nation to the guarded perimeters of American military bases, the threads of this story weave together into a single tapestry of fear, mystery, and unanswered questions. In Chapter 1, we began with history, the Navajo Code Talkers, men whose language helped turn the tide of World War II. Yet, behind that history, the same people carried warnings of something far darker. Skinwalkers, beings born from betrayal and black magic. In Chapter 2, we saw those warnings come to life in the old story of the ranch hand who shot what he thought was a coyote, only to discover the twisted remains of a half-human creature. His terror, his desperate flight, and his family's warning never to return became a chilling reminder that skinwalkers were not just figures of myth, but forces to be feared. Chapter 3 showed us how those same terrors echoed into modern times. Soldiers at Camp Navajo faced an old man who vanished into the shape of a rabbit. Marines at Camp Pendleton watched a deer rise on two legs and run like a man. Guardsmen during the Dixie Fire heard a woman's scream turn into their commander's own voice. And at Quantico, a military police officer saw a deer shatter its skull against a tree before standing upright and whispering, "I know you're there." And now in Chapter 4, we've anchored those experiences in reality through the collected testimonies and tales from the Grid Square and the teachings of Navajo medicine man and Marine veteran Wally Brown. We've acknowledged that skepticism exists, but we've also seen how disbelief does little to erase the fear or the uncanny patterns that repeat across generations. So, what do we make of all this? Were these encounters simply tricks of the mind born from fatigue, darkness, and stress? Or do they reveal something far older? A truth the Navajo have whispered for centuries, that the skinwalker walks still among us, deceiving, lurking, waiting. The truth may never be fully known. But one thing is certain: the stories will not stop. They will continue to be told by families in the desert, by soldiers on patrol, by veterans at the dinner table, decades after their service. And each story, whether we believe it or not, carries the same shadow forward into our time. That shadow now falls to you, the listener. What do you think these men and women truly saw? Were they hallucinations, coincidences, or encounters with something beyond explanation? If the legends are true, perhaps even speaking of the Skinwalker risks drawing its attention. But silence has never erased fear. It has only made the darkness deeper. So we leave you with this question. When the night is quiet and you hear a voice calling your name from the woods, will you answer?